September 1915, Western Front. A mining engineer with no military training watched thousands of British soldiers die on barbed wire that $500,000 worth of artillery shells couldn't destroy. So he built a 23-pound bear trap in a dugout using railway parts and pocket change that his own commanders called a gamekeeper's fantasy. When he secretly tested it in no man's land, the explosion was heard half a mile away and left a perfect 15-foot gap where an impenetrable barrier had stood seconds before. But here's what nobody expected. How did a device so simple that it cost $30 to build end up solving a problem that stumped the entire British military establishment? And why did they try so hard to keep his name out of the history books? The Western Front had turned into hell on earth. Across miles of torn ground, men died by the thousands every single day. The war everyone said would end by Christmas had dragged on for over a year, and now soldiers lived in muddy ditches called trenches, staring across a stretch of dead land at enemies doing the exact same thing. Between these lines of trenches lay no man's land, a space so dangerous that crossing it meant almost certain death. And the thing that made it so deadly wasn't bullets or shells. It was wire. Simple barbed wire, the same kind farmers used to keep cattle penned in, except the Germans had turned it into a wall of steel that stopped entire armies cold. The numbers told a story of slaughter. At a place called Lewes, just weeks before, British troops had climbed out of their trenches and tried to attack German positions. 50,000 men fell in 3 days. Most never even reached the enemy trenches. They got tangled in wire, hung up like fish in a net, while German machine guns cut them down. Some men stayed trapped there for hours, screaming for help that never came. Others bled out slowly in the night, just yards from safety, but unable to move. The wire held them fast, and the bullets found them easy. The German wire wasn't like the flimsy fences back home. These barriers stretched 30 to 100 yards deep. Steel stakes got pounded into the ground every 6 feet, each one holding loops and coils of thick barbed wire that stood as tall as a man. In some places, the wire was layered so thick you couldn't see through it. British commanders said artillery would solve the problem. Fire enough shells, they promised, and the wire would be blown to pieces. But it didn't work that way. 7 out of every 10 shells either buried themselves in the mud without exploding properly, or bounced off the wire and exploded somewhere useless. After a bombardment that cost thousands of pounds and used up train cars full of ammunition, the wire would still be there, maybe a bit messier, but just as impossible to cross. Into this nightmare walked a man named Reginald Clare Hart. He was 34 years old, a captain in the British Army, but he didn't look or act like the other officers. Clare Hart had spent his life working in tin mines down in Cornwall, using dynamite and tools to dig precious metal out of solid rock. He knew dirt and stone and how things broke. The army had given him a uniform and a rank because they needed bodies, but the career officers, the men who'd trained at fancy schools and studied warfare from books, they didn't think much of him. To them, he was just a civilian playing soldier. Clare Hart spent his days in the trenches, watching the attacks fail. He saw the planning meetings where generals moved little flags on maps and drew arrows showing how troops would advance. They always said the same thing: more shells, bigger guns, longer bombardments before the attack. Just keep pounding the wire until it breaks. But Clare Hart had been in those tin mines for 20 years. He knew something the generals didn't. Sometimes a huge explosion did nothing but make noise and smoke. But a small charge, placed exactly right, could drop a whole wall of rock. It wasn't about power. It was about putting the force where it needed to go. One night after another failed attack that left 200 men dead or wounded, Clare Hart went to a meeting with his commanders. He brought drawings he'd made, sketches showing a different way. Instead of firing shells from miles away and hoping they'd hit the wire, what if soldiers could crawl close at night and place small bombs right against the barriers? Not just bombs, though, something mechanical, something with moving part that would grab the wire and make sure the explosion went exactly where it needed to go. He'd seen traps used by gamekeepers to catch poachers, big metal jaws that snapped shut with enough force to break a man's leg. What if you made something like that, but filled it with explosives? The room went quiet when he finished explaining. Then one of the colonels, a man with a thick mustache and medals covering his chest, started laughing. Other officers joined in. A gamekeeper's fantasy, the colonel called it. "This is modern warfare," he said, "not some country estate hunting rabbits. We need artillery and tactics, not contraptions from a tin mine." Claire Hart tried to explain about force and placement, about how he'd seen small charges do what big ones couldn't. They wouldn't hear it. The meeting ended with Claire Hart being told to stop wasting everyone's time with stupid ideas and focus on his actual duties. But Claire Hart couldn't stop thinking about it. Every morning he watched men go over the top. Every evening he counted how many didn't come back. He'd walk the trench line after dark and hear wounded men crying out in no man's land, begging for help, their voices getting weaker as the night wore on. Most of them were caught in wire. The lucky ones died fast. He started keeping count in a notebook. How many men lost to wire? How many attacks failed because the wire held? How much money the army spent on shells that didn't work? The numbers made him sick. The generals had their way of doing things. They'd been trained at military schools. They'd read all the right books and studied famous battles. They knew how war was supposed to work. But Claire Hart had spent 2 decades underground with nothing but rock and explosives and problems that needed solving. He knew something they didn't. Sometimes the old ways stopped working. Sometimes you needed somebody who saw things different, who didn't know all the rules about how things were supposed to be done. The army kept trying the same failed solution over and over, expecting different results. And men kept dying in the wire while officers planned bigger bombardments and moved their little flags on maps. Claire Hart decided that if nobody would listen to him, he'd have to prove it himself, even if it cost him everything. Claire Hart found a quiet spot 15 feet below ground level, a dugout that smelled of damp earth and candle smoke. The space was barely big enough for 2 men to stand, but it gave him privacy and a flat surface to work on. He pulled out the backs of old requisition forms, the paperwork the army used to order supplies, and started drawing. His hands moved quickly, sketching lines and curves by candlelight. The idea in his head needed to get onto paper, where he could see if it would actually work. The design was simple but brutal. Picture a bear trap, the kind that could snap a man's leg in half, but bigger and meaner. The device would be 18 inches wide, with steel jaws that could slam shut with 400 pounds of force. That was enough pressure to crush bone or cut through thick rope. The jaws would be held open by a strong spring, and a thin wire would serve as the trigger. When something pulled that wire with just 3 pounds of pressure, the trap would snap shut. But this wasn't meant to catch animals. Inside those closing jaws would be explosives, and the whole thing would be placed right against the German wire. When it went off, the blast wouldn't go up into the air like a regular shell. It would shoot sideways, cutting through wire like a hot knife through butter. Claire Hart needed specific parts to make this work. The spring had to be just right, strong enough to generate 290 foot-pounds of energy. That was a precise measurement, not something you could guess at. He remembered seeing damaged railway equipment in the supply dumps, old buffer mechanisms with heavy-duty springs. Those buffers absorbed the shock when train cars coupled together, which meant they were built to handle serious force. He could salvage springs from those, and nobody would miss them. For the explosive, he calculated exactly 12 ounces of ammonol would do the job. That chemical mixture was stable enough to transport safely, but powerful when detonated. The housing around the explosive would be curved steel, shaped to push the blast outward in a 45-degree arc. Every angle mattered. Too wide and the force would be wasted. Too narrow and it wouldn't cut enough wire to be useful. Safety was crucial. The last thing anyone needed was one of these things going off by accident. Claire Hart designed 3 separate safeties into the trigger mechanism. All 3 had to be released in the right order or the device wouldn't arm. It made the setup more complicated, but it also meant a soldier could carry the thing without worrying about blowing himself up if he stumbled in the dark. He had no official permission and no budget, so Claire Hart used his own money. The amount wasn't small for a captain's salary, but he'd saved over the years, and he had no family to send it to. He found a Royal Engineers metalworker named Thomas Wickham, a sergeant who knew his way around a forge and a welding torch. Wickham was a practical man who didn't ask too many questions when Claire Hart showed him the drawings. They met at night when most men were sleeping, working in a workshop that was really just a reinforced shed behind the engineering depot. The noise of the front covered up the sound of their hammering and grinding. Building the first one took 4 hours. They worked by lamplight, measuring twice and cutting once. The device came together piece by piece. Wickham welded the housing while Claire Hart assembled the spring mechanism. They used metal scavenged from broken equipment, cutting and shaping it until it matched the drawings. When they finally had it complete, the thing weighed 23 pounds. It was heavy enough to be awkward, but light enough for one man to carry. Claire Hart held it in his hands and felt the weight of what he'd created. This wasn't theory anymore. This was real metal and real explosives. The test had to be unauthorized. If Claire Hart went through proper channels and asked permission, they'd say no. They'd already laughed at him once. So on October 3rd, 1915, at 2 in the morning, Claire Hart and Wickham crawled out of their trench into no man's land. The darkness was thick enough to hide in, but sounds carried strangely at night. Every scrape of equipment, every breath seemed too loud. German trenches sat 60 yards away, close enough that they could sometimes hear enemy soldiers talking. Claire Hart and Wickham moved inches at a time, dragging the device between them. The ground was torn up from shells, full of holes and debris. Spent bullet casings littered the dirt. Here and there they passed bodies that hadn't been recovered yet. When they reached the German wire, Claire Hart's hands shook as he placed the device. He attached the trigger wire to the barbed barrier, making sure the tension was right. 3 pounds of pull would set it off. He armed the safeties one by one, his fingers fumbling in the dark. Then they crawled back, taking 30 minutes to cover 60 yards. Back in the trench, they waited. Dawn came slowly, turning the sky from black to gray. Morning mist hung over no man's land like a blanket. At first light, German soldiers came out to inspect their wire defenses. This was routine for them, a morning patrol to check for British sabotage or gaps that needed repair. 4 men walked along the barrier, speaking German that Claire Hart couldn't understand but could hear clearly in the quiet morning air. One of them grabbed the wire to test its strength. That small tug was all it took. The explosion ripped through the silence like thunder. The sound echoed across half a mile of trenches. Men on both sides ducked instinctively. A cloud of smoke and dirt rose up, and when it cleared seconds later, Claire Hart saw what he'd created. A gap 15 feet wide had appeared in wire that yesterday had been solid. The German patrol was simply gone, erased. The blast had done exactly what the drawings predicted. Claire Hart's commanding officer was Major William Ashford, a man who should have arrested him on the spot for unauthorized action in no man's land. Court-martial was the standard punishment for what Claire Hart had done. But Ashford had lost 2 brothers at Loos. Both had died in wire while artillery shells exploded uselessly around them. Ashford stared at the gap in German wire for a long time without speaking. Then he turned to Claire Hart and said he had 48 hours and whatever materials he could quietly take from supply dumps without anyone noticing. "Make me 20 more," Ashford told him, "and God help us both if this doesn't work." Claire Hart and Wickham didn't sleep for the next 2 days. They refined the design with each unit they built. The Mark II version weighed only 17 pounds, 6 pounds lighter than the original. They figured out how to arm it in 90 seconds instead of the 3 minutes the first one required. The blast radius stayed the same because that was already perfect, but they made the housing stronger so it wouldn't fail under rough handling. Production time dropped from 4 hours to just 45 minutes per device. They built them in assembly line fashion, Wickham handling the metalwork while Claire Hart prepared the explosives and trigger mechanisms. The first real test came on October 18th during a raid on German positions at a place called Hohenzollern Redoubt. This wasn't some small patrol action. This was a planned assault involving hundreds of men, and Major Ashford had decided to bet their lives on Claire Hart's invention. Over 2 nights, engineering teams crawled into no man's land carrying 30 of the devices. They worked in complete darkness, placing each mine against the German wire at carefully measured intervals. 40 yards separated each device, which meant when they all went off, they'd create gaps spaced perfectly for infantry sections to pour through in single file. The engineers marked each position on maps so everyone would know exactly where the safe paths would open. The morning of the attack, Claire Hart stood in the trench watching hundreds of soldiers prepare to go over the top. These men had no idea about the new weapon. They'd been told to follow the gaps that would appear, but most of them expected the usual nightmare. They checked their rifles, fixed their bayonets, and wrote last letters home, because statistics said 40% of them wouldn't come back. That was the normal cost of crossing no man's land. 4 out of every 10 men became casualties before they even reached the enemy trench. Some units had it worse. At Loos, entire companies had been wiped out with 90% losses. The signal came. Engineers triggered all 30 mines at once using electrical detonators. The explosions merged into one continuous roar that shook the ground. Smoke and dirt filled the air. For a few seconds, nobody could see anything. Then the smoke began to clear, and Claire Hart saw what 30 of his devices could do. Where solid walls of wire had stood minutes before, there were now perfect gaps, each one 12 feet wide. The measurements were exact because the blast pattern was controlled. Regular artillery created random destruction, sometimes making gaps too narrow to use or blowing huge craters that troops couldn't cross. Claire Hart's mines cut clean paths at precise intervals, turning an impossible barrier into a gate with multiple doors. The infantry went forward. They moved fast, faster than anyone expected, pouring through the gaps in tight columns. German machine gunners opened fire, but they'd positioned their guns to cover wire that was no longer there. The British troops were already past the killing zone before the Germans could adjust. 17 minutes after the attack started, British soldiers held the German trench. The objective that commanders thought would take 3 hours had fallen in less than 20 minutes. The casualty count came in later that day. 23 wounded, 0 dead. Nobody could believe it. Attacks in this sector usually cost 200 casualties minimum. The numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. In the 6 months before Claire Hart's mines, attacks here averaged 40% casualties before reaching enemy trenches. 4 out of 10 men down before the real fighting even started. After the mines were used, that number dropped to 8%. The difference was so dramatic that at first, some officers thought the reports were wrong. They checked and rechecked the figures. But the math was clear. Claire Hart's invention had saved hundreds of lives in a single morning. Within 3 weeks, orders came through for 500 units. By December of 1915, over 2,000 Claire Hart mechanicals, as they were officially called, had been deployed across the Western Front. Production ramped up fast once the Army committed resources. Each mine cost £3 to build. That was cheap, almost laughably cheap, compared to what they'd been spending. Artillery shells cost £47 each, and you needed 80 shells for every 10 yards of wire you wanted to destroy. Even then, the shells only worked 30% of the time. Claire Hart's mines achieved 94% effectiveness. 94 out of every 100 devices functioned perfectly, and they could be placed silently at night without alerting the enemy that an attack was coming. Artillery bombardments announced your intentions hours in advance, giving the enemy time to prepare and bring up reinforcements. But the Germans weren't stupid. They learned fast. By January 1916, German commanders had figured out something new was happening. Their wire defenses were being destroyed with surgical precision, and they weren't hearing the usual artillery preparation. So they changed their tactics. Listening posts got moved closer to the wire. German patrols went out more frequently at night, searching for British soldiers placing the devices. They started using concrete posts instead of wooden stakes because concrete was harder to destroy. The wire itself got laid in multiple layers at different distances from the trench. If the British cut through the first layer, there'd be 2 more layers behind it. The innovation race had begun. Every time the British found an advantage, the Germans adapted. Every time the Germans created a new defense, the British had to counter it. This was how war worked. No advantage lasted forever. But for those first few months, Claire Hart's mines gave British forces an edge they'd never had before. The device's most famous moment came on February 12th, 1916, near a village called Fricourt. German forces had launched a counterattack the day before and managed to cut a gap in British wire. They planned to exploit that gap with a major assault involving about 120 men. German commanders liked dense formations because they could overwhelm defenses with sheer numbers. But those dense formations were also vulnerable if you could hit them at exactly the right moment. British engineers had spent the night seeding the area around the gap with 15 Claire Hart mines. Nobody told the Germans. The German assault came at dawn. Their troops moved in tight columns, trying to get through the gap quickly before British artillery could respond. The formations were so tight that men's shoulders almost touched. That was the moment the first mine detonated. The blast caught the leading troops at maximum density, right when they were bunched together with nowhere to go. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. 4 more mines went off within 8 seconds, one after another, each blast tearing through packed groups of soldiers. The noise was continuous, like thunder that wouldn't stop. Smoke filled the gap. When it cleared, the attack had collapsed. German soldiers who survived later said 40 men were killed or catastrophically wounded in those first 8 seconds. 40 men gone in less time than it takes to tie your boots. The remaining troops fell back in disorder. The attack never reached British lines. Reports from British headquarters in March 1916 gave Claire Hart's mine credit for cutting wire clearing costs by 82%. That meant the Army was spending less than a fifth of what it used to spend and getting better results. First wave survival rates increased by 47%. Nearly half again as many soldiers were making it through no man's land alive. Production eventually reached 15,000 units. The design got shared with French forces and Canadian troops. Other Allied nations wanted them too. Clare Hart received the Distinguished Service Order, a high military honor. There was a brief ceremony where a general pinned the medal to his chest and said some words about innovation and courage. But the invention itself was immediately classified as secret. The Army didn't want the Germans knowing exactly how the devices worked. And they especially didn't want newspapers writing stories about how a civilian tin miner had solved a problem that stumped the entire military establishment. Official histories mentioned improved engineering techniques, but left out Clare Hart's name. The generals preferred to take credit for new tactics and better training. Admitting that some amateur with no formal military education had shown them all up was embarrassing. So they buried his name in classified files and let the public think the Army had figured it out themselves. When the war finally ended in November 1918, Reginald Clare Hart took off his uniform and went back to Cornwall. He returned to the tin mines where he'd spent most of his adult life, going underground every day to dig metal out of rock. The work was hard and dirty and dangerous, the same as it had always been. Nobody there talked much about the war. Most men who'd served just wanted to forget. Clare Hart rarely mentioned what he'd done. When people asked about his Distinguished Service Order, he'd say he'd helped with engineering work and changed the subject. He never tried to patent his mine design, never asked for royalties, even though the Army built 15,000 of them. The device had saved thousands of lives, but Clare Hart didn't see how he could profit from something born out of watching men die. It felt wrong somehow, like putting a price on blood. He lived quietly for the next 4 decades. He married late to a schoolteacher named Margaret, who'd lost her first husband at the Somme. They had no children. Clare Hart worked in the mines until his body couldn't handle it anymore, then took a job as a mining consultant, advising companies on where to dig and how to use explosives safely. He died in 1962 at age 81. The local newspaper ran a small obituary that mentioned his mining career and his military service, but didn't explain what he'd invented. Most people at his funeral had no idea that the quiet old man in the box had changed how armies fought. He was buried in a country churchyard where grass grows over simple stones and tourists never visit. But his innovation refused to die. The basic idea, the concept of a mechanically triggered directional mine, kept evolving. Military engineers saw what Clare Hart had done and built on it. During the Second World War, German forces developed something called the S-mine, a device that used springs and triggers much like Clare Hart's original design. The S-mine was nastier, designed to jump up out of the ground before exploding to cause maximum casualties, but the mechanical principles were the same. Spring-loaded mechanism, simple trigger, directional blast. The Germans never knew they were copying ideas from a British tin miner who'd worked in a dugout with salvaged parts. After that war ended, American weapons designers created the M18 Claymore mine in the 1950s. The Claymore became one of the most famous weapons of the 20th century, used in every American conflict from Vietnam to Afghanistan. And if you look at the technical specifications, you can see Clare Hart's fingerprints all over it. The Claymore produces a directional blast across a 60-degree arc. Clare Hart's original mine used a 45-degree arc. That's only a 15-degree difference after the 40 years of development. The Claymore's shaped charge, the curved explosive housing that directs the blast outward instead of in all directions, that came directly from Clare Hart's innovation. So did the mechanical trigger system with multiple safeties to prevent accidental detonation. The modern mine weighs more and uses different explosives and has electrical backup detonation options, but strip away the updates and you're looking at the same device a tin miner sketched on requisition forms in 1915. The numbers are remarkable when you track the evolution. Claire Hart's blast pattern was 45 degrees. The Claymore uses 60 degrees. His device weighed 17 pounds in its final form. The Claymore weighs 3.5 pounds because modern explosives are more powerful and modern materials are lighter. But the geometry, the physics, the basic understanding of how to make an explosion go where you want it to go, that all traces back to a dugout 15 feet underground where a man with no formal weapons training solved a problem through pure practical experience. Vietnam War veterans can tell you stories about Claymore mines. They were used to defend base camps, placed around the perimeter with tripwires running to likely enemy approaches. They were used in ambushes, set up along trails, and detonated when enemy troops walked into the kill zone. The distinctive shape, the curved rectangle with its aiming sights and its legs that stick into the ground, that became as familiar to American soldiers as their own rifles. And every single one of those mines, millions produced over decades, carried forward the core innovation of a man who died unknown. Modern militaries still use descendants of Claire Hart's design. Current area denial systems, the equipment used to block enemy movement or protect important locations, they employ the same principles. Directional shape charges, mechanical and electronic triggers, blast patterns calculated to destroy obstacles or disable vehicles or stop infantry. The U.S. military's current M18A1 mine includes design elements directly traceable to 1915. The shape charge housing, the trigger redundancy, the careful calculation of blast arc and effective range. These weren't common knowledge when Claire Hart invented them. He figured them out by thinking about how rock breaks and how force travels through different materials. The lesson here runs deeper than military history. It's about how innovation actually happens. The British Army in 1915 had everything they needed to solve the wire problem. They had factories, they had materials, they had thousands of educated officers and millions of pounds in budget. What they didn't have was a willingness to listen to someone who didn't fit their idea of what an expert looked like. Claire Hart wasn't from the right schools. He hadn't studied at military academies. He didn't have letters after his name or a family history of service. He was just a working man who'd spent 20 years underground learning how to make things break efficiently. And that supposedly irrelevant experience, that background everyone dismissed as having nothing to do with modern warfare, that's exactly what let him see a solution nobody else could see. The generals looked at barbed wire and thought about artillery, because artillery was how armies dealt with obstacles. Claire Hart looked at barbed wire and thought about how he'd place a charge to bring down a mineshaft support beam without collapsing the whole tunnel. Different experience, different perspective, different solution. We face similar challenges today. Climate change threatens millions of lives, but progress comes slowly because institutions resist changes to how things have always been done. Pandemic response fails because health organizations stick to old playbooks even when they're not working. Artificial intelligence development races forward, while safety concerns get dismissed by people who claim expertise but might be missing something crucial. In every case, the pattern repeats. Established experts with impressive credentials stick to conventional approaches, while unconventional solutions get ignored or mocked. Sometimes the right answer is waiting somewhere unexpected. Maybe it's a teenager who grew up with technology the experts don't understand. Maybe it's someone from a completely different field who sees connections nobody else notices. Maybe it's a worker with practical experience that didn't come from any classroom. The most dangerous assumption in any crisis is that the people in charge already know the best solution. History says otherwise. History says some of the most important innovations come from people nobody was listening to, people whose ideas got dismissed right up until the moment they proved everyone wrong. Claire Hart's bear trap mine didn't just save thousands of lives during World War I. It proved something more important. It proved that the person who solves your biggest problem might be standing right there with the answer, sketching it on scrap paper, trying to get someone, anyone, to pay attention. The question isn't whether unconventional solutions exist. They do. The question is whether we're humble enough to listen when they come from unexpected places.